Great to be here with you this morning. Before we get started on the presentation, I think we'll have a math test. It was $1,999.60. Somebody figure out what that would be worth today while we're talking here. And then I'm glad Ron kind of changed that. I wasn't quite sure if he was talking about that particular year and my age or if there was some other connection, but I think he finally got to the point. So thank you, Ron. This morning we're going to do a budget update for you. We'll focus on 4 different areas, look quickly at economic data, what it's showing us, both actual and what we're projecting going forward. We'll look at state revenue, and we'll talk about how state revenue has done and what we're expecting for the next year or two. We'll do an update on state spending, and then finally, we'll talk more about status, both for the current fiscal year and what we're looking at as we move forward. So economic data first. Personal income is one thing that we like to look at. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. Personal income did have, you can kind of see that blip up towards the end of 2012. That was as investors were kind of reacting to federal tax policy. We had a nice blip up in income, but it came back down. Percentage growth has been around the 2% mark over the last few quarters. Unemployment rates have continued mainly to come down. U.S. and Missouri, relatively close, follow one another. We did have a slight blip up in the Missouri unemployment data, the most recent, largely I think driven by the fact that people are coming back into the job market. So that's not unexpected to start seeing a little bit higher unemployment rate as more people actually enter the job market and start looking for work. Current employment, flip side of the unemployment data, we are continuing to see some growth, a little close to 2% growth, not quite there yet. Certainly going to need to see things pick up a little bit more to fully recover from the position that we lost. We're still not quite back up to the number of jobs that we had prior to the downturn. Inflation continues to be very steady and low. Inflation rate hovering around 2%, particularly when you factor out food and fuel. Very low inflation rate. Good in some respects, not so good in others, because part of what drives inflation rate is obviously salary increases in the economy moving forward. So low, okay, but certainly wouldn't hurt for this to come up a little bit closer to normal. Taxable sales in Missouri, in addition to personal income, which we've talked about, individual income tax being our largest source of revenue, sales tax is the second largest source, so we do pay attention to taxable sales. Continuing to see growth there. The line is the percent change, and you're seeing growth in taxable sales hovering around the 2% mark, a little bit of fluctuation there, but hovering around 2%. What does all of that mean for our revenue? Well, let's start out with what our general revenue collections are made up of. Fiscal year 2014, which was the year that just ended, June 30th, so last fiscal year. Our revenue collections for our largest fund, general revenue fund, was $8.003 billion. 68% of that, the individual income tax. That's why we follow those statistics very closely. Sales tax at 23%, and then you can see the smaller slices of the revenue pie, corporate, county, foreign, and then all other sources of revenue into our general revenue fund. This pie has not changed a lot. Individual income tax has made up a little bit larger percentage of the pie every year over the last couple of decades. Largely because the other slices have had tax policy changes that have reduced them, like the decision to exempt food from the general revenue sales tax, for example, reduced that sales tax piece of the pie. Missouri General Revenue Collections, this is a projection, and I like to show this because we are moving forward. We're making a little bit of progress with increased revenue collections over the last few years. The orange is the actual revenue that we have collected for general revenue. The blue is the projection if we would have grown since 2008 at the normal growth rate of 3.5% per year. So you can see the big gap between normal and actual during the economic downturn in 2009, 2010, 2011. You can see that we were making some progress, gaining back a little bit of that ground in 2012 and 2013. And then fiscal year 2014, last fiscal year happened, and we actually saw a decline. So in fiscal year 2014, we would have expected, if things would have been normal that whole time, to have had about $9.8 billion in general revenue collections. We actually had $8.003 billion, so a very significant gap. And pointing out that back in 2008, we were still slightly higher than we managed to collect in fiscal year 2014. So below that level, not even adjusted for inflation. These are actuals, these are not inflation-adjusted numbers. General revenue as a percent of personal income, also important, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, many of you may be aware that we have a lid on how much general revenue we can collect. It's based on looking at personal income and comparing our revenue collections to that. Back in the days, we actually returned money to taxpayers because we were collecting too much. We can collect about 5.5%, a little bit over that, % of personal income before we need to return any to Missouri taxpayers. Right now, we're hovering at around 3.4%, 3.3%, which means we have a gap between what we can collect and what we do collect of about $3 billion. So I don't think we need to worry about the Hancock Amendment for quite some time to come. We're going to talk about state spending now, looking at overall state spending and then more specifically at education. So this is our overall general revenue budget. Again, this is general revenue. This does not include riverboat gaming. This does not include lottery, does not include highway funds and other earmarked funds. We're talking about our main source of revenue here, general revenue. Elementary and secondary education, 35% of the budget in fiscal year 2014, the year that just ended. Higher education at 10%. Human services, which is mental health, health and senior services, services for people with disabilities, the Medicaid program, et cetera, is at 30%. So comparing that to what we see in fiscal year 2015, which is the year that we're in right now, if you'll see on this one, elementary and secondary at 35. In the fiscal year 2015 budget, elementary and secondary education, slightly higher percentage of general revenue at 36%. Higher education, just slightly higher as well. The piece of the pie that shrank here in fiscal year 2015 was the human services piece of the pie. DESE, looking specifically at funding that occurs through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. As we saw, the total for the fiscal year that just ended, $2.9 billion in general revenue. The largest portion of that, obviously, to the foundation formula. Almost 90% of the funding in the department's budget is for the foundation formula. The second largest piece is for the various special education programs, early childhood plus school-aged, and then you'll see the board-operated schools, transportation, and then everything else that is appropriated through DESE's budget. Again, the same thing basically for fiscal year 2015, the formula at a slightly lower percentage. That money went to, that little wedge that it lost went to special education. So a slightly higher percentage of the K through 12 budget going to special education in fiscal year 2015 as compared to fiscal year 2014. Same information just quickly for higher education. You can see most of the funding for higher education goes to the institutions, but the second largest piece is obviously scholarships, which includes the scholarships for the kids coming out of your schools, including A+, Access, Bright Flight. We have, since 2009, as you have done, reduced spending in various ways in order to get our budgets back into balance. A lot of these things that we did in 2009, 2010, 2011 were things that basically downsized state government on a permanent basis. They were things that made us more efficient. Some of them were painful, but they were things that are lasting reductions, and basically tried to control the cost of various state agencies, pension and health care costs, the Medicaid program, et cetera. What these things were during that time, though, were things that did, as I said, help make us more efficient. But we did a lot of cuts, just as you did, during that time period. And basically anything that was easy to cut, if that word even existed in those cuts, has happened. Anything where we were looking at efficiencies, the right thing to do, those types of reductions have happened. So as we move forward, if we have to continue cutting the state budget because revenue just doesn't keep up, you are looking at things now that really aren't in that vein. You're talking about less money for the foundation formula. You're talking about less money for services for people with disabilities and seniors. Current status, I am going to back up with this just a minute and talk about fiscal year 2013, 2 fiscal years ago, because it kind of sets the stage for the year that just ended. In fiscal year 2013, revenue growth was estimated at 4.8%. We ended the year with revenue growth of 10%. As I mentioned previously, you saw that blip up in personal income at the end of calendar year 2012 because, largely because people were taking investment earnings early to avoid federal tax policy changes that would have increased their taxes in calendar year 2013. So that's why we saw that big blip up in revenue in fiscal year 2013. Biggest growth was in declarations and remittances. Again, that's due to investment income capital gains. But it was a one-time blip up. If you looked at the withholding tax, which is our major source of individual income, that's the amount of tax that comes out of your paycheck every pay period, that grew by 3.5%. Good growth, but it was certainly not the 10% growth that we saw overall. Fiscal year 2014, the year that just ended, collections were actually down by 1% in fiscal year 2014. We had projected 2% growth, so that would have been modest growth, but we did not even see that. We saw a decline of 1%. The individual income taxes were down 1.5%, largely driven, the flip side of what we saw in fiscal year 2013. Remittances were down 14%. So we saw a nice increase in those remittances in fiscal year 2013 due to those one-time capital gains, but we saw the reverse of that, the decline in fiscal year 2014. Withholding taxes, that major source, the money that comes out of your paycheck, up modestly at 1.6%. Missouri was not unique. Most states saw this issue. Most states saw the capital gains benefit them in fiscal year 2013 and then saw a much less revenue than expected in fiscal year 2014. Sales taxes actually did fairly well last year, or at least well in comparison to how poorly they had done during the economic downturn with growth of 2.8%. Corporate taxes continued their decline at 4.7%. We really don't expect that to change because of recent state tax policy changes that will continue to reduce the amount of corporate tax collections. So legislature passed legislation that will continue to reduce that corporate income for the state of Missouri. Future outlook. So for the current year that we're in, fiscal year 2015, because fiscal year 2014 was so low on revenue, we would have to grow by about 10%. So general revenue would need to grow 10% in order to hit the revenue that we need to fund the budget that we have. We would need on top of that growth of about 2.7% in our core revenue to make up for the tax cuts that were approved by the legislature. Now, those were bills that the governor vetoed, but the legislature will have an opportunity to override those vetoes in September. So we're talking about 10 to 13% growth needed to fill up the buckets that were appropriated in the fiscal year 2015 budget. We're projecting a shortfall because of all of that of about $800 million in the current fiscal year budget. That's made up of a couple of pieces that are outlined there. $217 million of that due to the tax cut legislation, which I'll come back to and speak about briefly here in just a minute. A big chunk of it, $400 to $430 million shortfall due to the fact that revenue came in so low last year. That not only reduced the amount of carryover that we had into the current year, but it dramatically reduced the base. So we're projecting about a $400 to $430 million shortfall in our base revenue. That assumes that we get to 5.2% growth. So if we have better growth than that, that number comes down. If we have lower growth than that, that number gets worse. 5.2% is actually pretty reasonable given how low the base is. So we're not overly concerned about that 5.2% assumption right now. We also have a shortfall due to the fact that the legislature did not approve tax amnesty that would have brought $51.8 million in to help us support the budget. That did not happen. And the Attorney General's office has informed us that our tobacco settlement payments are going to be $50 million lower than projected. That does impact our general revenue fund because tobacco settlement basically pays for the same things the general revenue pays for. And then finally, you'll see this weird word here, 60 million supplementals. What does that mean? There are mandatory programs that we believe are going to need more general revenue. There are some programs, for example, in the K through 12 DESE budget for early childhood education, which generally require a supplemental every year, along with some other programs. Future outlook. I mentioned we'd come back to this. At the end of session last year, this past session, the legislature passed 10 bills that would reduce our revenue collections in the current year. The estimated impact of those 10 bills combined for our general revenue fund, because that's the fund we're largely talking about here, is an impact of $280 million, so a reduction of $280 million. That is for a full 12-month period. Because we're already part of the way into our fiscal year 2015, our current year, and will be a couple more months before those bills would go into effect if the legislature chose to override the governor. It's a smaller impact in the current fiscal year, $217 million. Those bills would also impact other state and local revenue because they are sales tax cuts largely. So they would have an impact, for example, on the Prop C for K through 12 education, as well as conservation, parks and soils, and local sales tax revenue. Proposition C, we don't have this number up here, but this is the sales tax that gets distributed to your schools based on weighted average daily attendance. And we are projecting a loss of about $94 million to Prop C collections because of those tax bills. That is about $105 per weighted average daily attendance, to give you some idea of the impact. So $105 per weighted average daily attendant loss because of these bills. Total impact on all state and local funds estimated at over $770 million on a full year basis. So what are we looking towards moving forward? If revenues were going to basically follow the economy, we would expect to continue to see some improvement. The economy is moving forward. We are seeing growth in jobs. We are seeing a little bit of growth in income. We are seeing an increase in sales, so people are spending money again. So if you were just looking at the base economy and projecting going forward, we really ought to start seeing some growth in our general revenue collections again. However, due to a combination of legislation that has passed that would impact our collections, basically reduce taxes, reduce revenue, we shouldn't expect much growth moving forward. We'll have the sales tax reductions if the legislature decides to override the governor that will go into effect this fiscal year, have even a larger impact next fiscal year 2016. And then the year after that, the tax cuts that were passed, the income tax cuts that were passed by the legislature, will go into effect in fiscal year 2017. So we'll start seeing a reduction in our individual income tax collections due to that legislation in fiscal year 2017. So you have this hopeful sign from the economy of revenue making a rebound, but probably being dragged down a little bit because of those legislative changes that will reduce our collections. To talk just a little bit, because this is education arena, we're going to talk about lottery and riverboat gaming. Lottery collections in fiscal year 2013, actual collections $288.8 million. The fiscal year 2014 budget, which is again the year that just ended, the legislature assumed that we would have $315.6 million in lottery revenue. That was probably not a reasonable assumption. That would have required growth of 9.3%, which would have been hefty growth. The problem is actual revenue ended up at $267.3 million, or a decline of 7.4%. We're looking into why that happened. We were talking at the table earlier about gambling and kind of the national trend in reduced gambling. People are just not as interested in doing it. That is probably having some impact, but we're also looking at perhaps there were some administrative issues going on at the lottery with choice about gamings, lottery tickets and such. The fiscal year 2015 budget, the year that we're in, assumes lottery of $299 million, which would require 11.9% growth over what we actually had in fiscal year 14. That's hefty growth, but if you compare it to fiscal year 13, it's only 3.5% growth. So is that possible? Yes. I don't know that we should claim it to be likely, though. So at the moment, I would assume that we're going to have a shortfall in lottery again in the current year, which of course lottery is all earmarked for education, both K through 12 and higher education. So I would anticipate that we're not going to be able to fully fund our lottery appropriations once again in the current year. Riverboat gaming is 100% dedicated to the foundation formula. So any shortfall in riverboat gaming does impact the formula. Fiscal year 13, actual collections $329 million. Fiscal year 14 assumed 342, which would have required growth of 4.2%. Reasonable in normal times, but these are not normal times. Actual collections $314 million, or decline of 4.5% is what actually happened in fiscal year 14. We would need 8% growth in riverboat gaming money to fill up the appropriation approved by the legislature for the formula in fiscal year 15. Again, possible, not likely. Probably we'll see a shortfall in riverboat gaming. And again, that's a direct impact on the foundation formula. So kind of a summary of where we are, where we're headed. I think kind of a summary of it, the economy is turning around. We're starting to see some improvement in jobs. We're seeing some improvement in consumer confidence. We are hopeful that will kind of show up in our revenue collections as we move forward. Unfortunately, there are some other things counterbalancing that will drag our revenue back down a little bit, legislative policy decisions to reduce our revenue stream. So So should we see some growth moving forward? Yes, but will it be growth at the levels we would have expected in the past? Probably not. And will it catch us back up to that big gap that we saw earlier between our actual collections and what we would have projected we would be at this point in time? No, we just simply are not going to get there. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay. Anybody? Questions? Happy to do it. I know this is a large group, but happy. Yes, sir. Good question. The question was, how are we doing compared to our neighboring states? In general, Missouri is actually doing a little bit better when it comes to economic indicators than the Midwest states in general. So slightly better job growth, slightly better turnaround in income. The Midwest in general is slower than the nation as a whole. Where the harder analysis comes is when you're starting to talk about what impact that's having on our state revenue collections for a budget perspective. If you compare how Missouri is doing to Kansas, you feel really good right now. Kansas made a decision to reduce revenue, and they cut taxes, and it is showing up in their ability to fund education and other state services. So tax policy makes a difference. In Kansas, right now at least, it is resulting in huge discrepancies between their projected revenue collections and what they're actually seeing. Other states around us have not made those kind of dramatic changes in their tax policy. So relative to the other states around us, we're probably right around average on what we're seeing with our budget, our revenue and our budget. All of the states really around us did see the same phenomenon that we did, with the big spike and decline because of capital gains. It's kind of how we're doing. Other questions? Yes, sir?
Linda, we know that the governor came out and asked for funding during the state address, and has a picture to fully fund the foundation formula by the time that he leaves. My question is not necessarily from a legislative or a political standpoint, but based upon the numbers that you see, is there a legitimate opportunity over the next 2 fiscal years for us to be able to do that?
In case you didn't hear the question, from a just purely technical standpoint, revenue standpoint, is it possible that we would be able to see full funding in the foundation formula over the next 2 years? I think it would be extremely challenging to get to that point. Not impossible, but extremely challenging, both because our revenue is not doing quite as well as anticipated this year, but more importantly because of legislation that's already passed, already been implemented. It's not up for debate anymore. We are going to see a reduction, at least in the short term, in our individual income tax collections because of legislation that has already passed. So it's almost a $600 million swing between what we had last year and full funding. That's going to be hard to get to over the next 2 years. Other? Yes, sir.
Are we getting more capital gains revenue? The stock market's been up for a while in the 90s. We got a lot more revenue because of the booming stock market. Are we seeing that now?
Yeah, the question is around capital gains and what we're seeing in revenue due to the capital gains. We actually did see some pretty good collection increases for a couple of years. Fiscal year 12, the state did see some gain because of capital gains revenue for investors. We also saw really good gain, as we discussed in fiscal year 2013, from capital gains. But I think where we are now on that is we'll probably see steadier growth going forward, more in the 2% range or so. We're not going to see super growth anymore. We got that in fiscal year 2013. So we will see some positive impact as the markets continue to do so well, which we all like to see. But it won't be probably the really stellar growth that we saw in fiscal year 2013. Other questions? If none, I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning.